This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Wednesday, the 22nd of November. I'm Oliver Conway with a selection of highlights from across the BBC World Service. Coming up, after 37 years, the end of an era in Zimbabwe.
I, Robert Mugabe, hereby formally tender my resignation with immediate effect.
The one-time liberation leader had ruled Zimbabwe with an iron fist, but the people had finally lost their fear.
Today it's victory, and I'm an activist and I've been fighting. It has been the worst experience. This is what we've always wanted. We don't want him anymore.
As thousands thronged the streets in celebration, the opposition said it was hopeful for the future.
I think it will go down like in 1980 when we got our independence as a very memorable occasion.
We speak to our correspondents in Harare and we ask what happens now amid reports that Emmerson Mnangagwa, the sacked vice president, will be sworn in as Zimbabwe's new leader in the coming days. So, after 37 years of rule through intimidation and cunning, Robert Mugabe has finally agreed to step down. He had said that only God could remove him, but as MPs began impeachment proceedings against him, the Speaker of Parliament read out this letter from the 93-year-old president.
I, Robert Mugabe, hereby formally tender my resignation as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe with immediate effect.
The letter also said Mr Mugabe's decision was voluntary and aimed at a smooth transfer of power. The news swiftly reached the streets of Harare. The BBC's Ben Brown was broadcasting from a balcony in the city at the time.
They are cheering now as the news comes through to them on their mobile phones. Listen to that noise. There are car horns blaring. There are people running through the park down there. Let's have a look at what's going on, because you can hear car horns blaring now. And people in the centre of Harare, absolutely delirious. This is the moment that they have been waiting for. Nobody knows quite what is going to replace it, to be absolutely honest, but everything has changed in Zimbabwe. I don't think anyone can doubt that now. The genie is out of the bottle. The people have tasted people power. They've come out onto the streets in their tens of thousands. They are still, as I speak, literally running.
I cannot believe he is gone. I'm happy. I'm so happy.
We're really overwhelmed, hey?
It is an incredible moment, and it is a moment of history in post-colonial Africa. Utter euphoria, utter jubilation. And I think for these young Zimbabweans, many of whom have only ever known life under Robert Mugabe, people who have criticised him have been arrested, they've been beaten, they've been tortured, and they've been murdered. And now Zimbabwe is free of Robert Mugabe. Extraordinary scenes.
Ben Brown in Harare. Robert Mugabe had ruled Zimbabwe since independence in 1980, first as Prime Minister, then as President. He silenced opposition through fear and intimidation, including the killing of an estimated 20,000 civilians in Matabeleland. Linda Mazarira, a human rights activist who was jailed for protesting against him, gave her reaction to the news of his resignation.
Now I believe that I did not suffer in vain, because I always believed that Mugabe was going to step down in my lifetime, and it has happened. I dreamt stepping on top of Mugabe's head, and just today I now know what it means. I even told my mate and my parents that this is what I dreamt, and it has finally happened. I believe that it is the people power, because all along Mugabe was disillusioned that people liked him. Go and arrest President Mugabe, go to Zimba and be a granddad.
Another person who was happy is Ben Freeth, a Zimbabwean who faced eviction as part of a campaign against white farmers.
We suffered under Mugabe, and what we're seeing out here in the streets is an end to that suffering. People are so relieved that this suffering is over, we believe. The oppression is gone. Black, white, farmers, town people, rich people, poor people, we're celebrating, we're hugging each other. We are so excited about what's happened.
Well, the kind of display seen on the streets would have been unthinkable only a few weeks ago. Such was the level of control that Mr Mugabe exerted over the population. But his efforts to make his wife Grace Mugabe his successor angered his fellow veterans of the independence struggle. And when he sacked his former ally Emmerson Mnangagwa as vice president, the army moved against him and his ZANU-PF party turned its back. The world's oldest head of state did have one final trick up his sleeve, refusing to follow the script on Sunday night when he had been expected to resign. But what in the end persuaded him to go? I spoke to the BBC's Julian Keane on Tuesday night as people celebrated in Harare.
I can tell you, Ollie, the fear has gone, and that is clear to see. There are thousands of people who've gathered where I am now in central Harare on Africa Unity Square. A few days ago, there were a few hundred people praying for peace. Today, they've come out. You could say their prayers have been answered. People are jubilant. People, just to the right of me, there is a military vehicle. There are soldiers there. People are taking selfies with soldiers. I've just been joined by a couple, Simba and Florence. How did you get here?
Yeah, we've come all the way from home. We were watching BBC on TV, and then, hey, you were so excited. Said, hey, we can't miss this opportunity to celebrate because we are now free. For 37 years, we've been under hostage from this man. So now we think our hopes are now going to be what? We're going to be happy because we've got dreams. Our dreams are now almost shattered, but we are so happy. I don't know how I can say it.
Florence, some people are describing this as Zimbabwe's second Independence Day.
Yes, it is. For me, I was very young when they had their first independence in 1980. But for me, this one is like a new era, a new day has just begun, and we are prepared to walk through it all and see a new day tomorrow. I'm just so excited.
I'm going to let you enjoy the day. As you see there, Ollie, people talking about a new dawn, a new Independence Day. People not yet thinking about the future. They want to really just enjoy the moment, Ollie.
And do we know where Robert Mugabe and Grace are now?
The big question. We're hearing from a ZANU-PF official, ZANU-PF, of course, the governing party, that Mr Mugabe and his wife Grace may be in their home. To be honest, that hasn't been confirmed yet. We're still waiting some sort of official confirmation. But this isn't really the day for this couple to be seen in public. This is the day for the people to have their say. What happens as far as Mr Mugabe and his wife Grace has got to be said, detested by a big part of the population here. That is another issue. People are just wondering, they're wondering maybe what's happening tomorrow, the week after, but right now it's like change. Some change better than no change at all.
Julian, we'll be back with you in a moment, but Robert Mugabe's resignation brings to an end one of the most remarkable political careers in modern African history. Born into a Catholic family in the British colony of Southern Rhodesia in 1924, Robert Mugabe played a leading role in ending white rule. But his long years in power, presiding over the brutal suppression of dissent, land seizures, economic collapse and hyperinflation, saw him reviled as a tyrant. Andrew Harding looks back now at the career of a man who, until his resignation, was the world's oldest leader.
To begin with, he was a hero, the liberation fighter who guided Zimbabwe to independence after decades of white minority colonial rule.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, do swear that I will be faithful.
And afterwards, the message at first to the white population was one of reconciliation.
Our main concern should now be to join hands in building our country so that we can create a new Zimbabwe with a new national faith, a new national love, binding all its people.
For a time, the economy prospered. The country seemed well run. But Mr Mugabe soon showed a ruthless streak, crushing his opponents. And by the year 2000, as the economy struggled and political opposition grew, he lashed out, sending his supporters to take over white-owned farms violently.
This Zimbabwe is for black people, not for white.
The result was catastrophic. The economy collapsed. To stay in power, Mr Mugabe's ZANU-PF party began rigging elections and terrorising its opponents. Western sanctions followed. And hyperinflation, the currency collapsing in spectacular fashion. But an ageing president refused to back down.
I will declare the fight to be on. And it will be a fight to the finish, I can tell you. And they won't win the fight, we will win it.
But it was his second wife, Grace, who proved to be his undoing. Her lavish spending made her unpopular, but it was when Zimbabweans realised that Grace was being groomed to succeed her husband that things changed dramatically. No one wanted a dynasty, least of all the military, and with a power struggle growing inside the governing ZANU-PF party, the army intervened last week. And now, after days of drama, a man who might once have left office, an African icon, was forced out, his humiliation complete.
Andrew Harding there. Let's go back to Julian in Harare. Julian, for many Zimbabweans, Robert Mugabe will be the only leader they've ever known. Is there any residual feelings for him?
There are still some residual feelings. People don't forget that he was the man who brought independence to the country, and that is an important part of his profile, of his story, of his history, and also of his legacy. But somewhere along the line, along those 37 years in power, it all turned sour. Frankly, he just got things wrong, and the population who loved and adored him have now turned against him. So, you know, there were some people will tell you very honestly, I've got mixed feelings. You know, they call him the father of the nation. He's an elder. There's a lot of respect in this country for your elders. It's very important. A lot of people wanted to give him a dignified exit. Right now, the exit is there. It is happening. It has happened. He's stepped down. Right now, some little bangs going on in the background. Always a little bit of worry when that happens. No, just fireworks. People are celebrating. That's the story of the day. It's a momentous day, a bit of history. Mugabe goes down in history for various reasons. Put it like that.
Julian Keane in Harare. So as we heard, joy on the streets and in Parliament when Robert Mugabe's resignation was announced, but not everyone was happy. The ZANU-PF MP, Terence Mukupe, said many of his fellow politicians were in tears.
What was quite interesting was that, like, when the letter was read out, only half of the House was actually celebrating. Almost every ZANU-PF MP was actually almost in tears. A lot of guys were crying because we didn't want this for our leader. We still love our leader, and we didn't want our leader to go out this way because it felt like, things could have been done in a much better way.
But the Mugabe era is now over, and veteran opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai told the BBC he hoped Zimbabwe was on a new trajectory that would include free and fair elections.
Well, I'm sure that the people of Zimbabwe will look back to this day with a hefty degree of nostalgia, because it's something that they've been wishing for the last 5 years. But it's been very difficult to achieve because of the machinery that has been put to prevent it. So like in any new birth, I think the celebration represents a new feeling. And I think it will go down like in 1980 when we got our independence as a very memorable occasion.
Morgan Tsvangirai. Well, James Menendez has been speaking to Priscilla Missy Herabwe Mushonga, one of the opposition MDC's MPs, and asked for her reaction to what's happened.
Well, very emotional, very surreal, unbelievable.
What was it like when the letter was read out?
Well, I was actually in the middle of making a presentation. I was the one who was debating on the motion of the impeachment when the letter came in. So we thought this was a way of trying to stop the proceedings because he had been trying to do that. And when the speaker then said, I have something to read out, and started by saying this is a letter, of resignation from Robert Mugabe, it was just unbelievable and emotional, particularly for me because I was in the middle of making a presentation.
Were you surprised? Did you think the impeachment process was going to drag out for days and possibly longer?
No, we're clear that it wasn't. We had made up our mind that we're going to impeach him. Like we have said before, there is no provision for a time frame. You can do it within 2 weeks, you can do it within a day. And the agreement between ourselves is members of parliament had been, we're going to wrap this up today.
In the letter, of course, he said that it was his decision to step down. Do you buy that?
I think he may have realised by the time we were gathered, if the impeachment process was going on, he may have realized that it was game up. And that the best way to have a little bit of dignity would be for him to do that letter and say, I have not been impeached. I think it would have been a terrible legacy. It's already a terrible legacy, but it would have been a terrible legacy, not only for his political party, but for a whole parliament to fire him.
And what is that terrible legacy, do you think?
Well, the terrible legacy is that you end your end of your political career in a manner in which those that used to speak well of you, those that used to hero worship you, basically stand up and begin to tell you to go to hell. And yet he had been revered. This man that had not only been revered in Zimbabwe, but revered internationally. You would know that Mugabe is a very proud man. And he would have wanted to go proudly out, knowing that it is him who has finally said, I anoint this particular person. And this must be really sad for a proud man like Robert Mugabe.
But I can't imagine that you revered him very much.
No, I certainly did not revere him. I did appreciate anybody who went to the liberation struggle. I was too young to go to the liberation struggle. So from that point, I appreciated the role that he had played. But unfortunately, as the years went by, particularly when he did the Gukuraundi issue, which is what I was saying in my presentation, that he lost me in 1983. I did not lose Mugabe yesterday like ZANU-PF did. He lost me in 1983 when he murdered 20,000 people in Matabeleland. And that's where I lost Mugabe. The struggle was to convince others to see what some of us had seen before.
But that was such a long time ago. That was 34 years ago, and yet he clung on to power.
Exactly. And which is why some of us feel that those that are in ZANU-PF really need to do an introspection, because if they kept this man, even after he had done the kind of atrocities that he did, I worry whether they will be the kind of people who will turn a leaf and really deliver to the people of Zimbabwe a democratic country. That concerns me and that worries me.
Opposition MP Priscilla Misiherabwe Mushonga. So what does the future hold for Zimbabwe? I spoke to our Africa regional editor Mary Harper and started by asking her who's in charge now.
Well, at the moment, the military, I suppose, is still in charge. They basically took over Zimbabwe last week. But the talk is that the sacked Vice President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, will be the next president of Zimbabwe within the next 48 hours. So he's the man that we should all be setting our sights on at the moment. But I think this evening, as has been made abundantly clear by my colleague Julian Keane, it's almost the people of Zimbabwe's time to be in charge, at least for an evening of celebration, and also some more poignant thoughts about Robert Mugabe, who, as has been pointed out, brought their country to independence in 1980.
Yeah, the suggestion is that Emmerson Mnangagwa will serve out the remainder of Robert Mugabe's term. He is closely linked to Robert Mugabe.
Very closely. I mean, in some ways, he's a sort of junior carbon copy of Robert Mugabe, 20 years his junior, but he has been associated with periods of intense violence in Zimbabwe, both pre-independence and post-independence, and indeed in relation to Morgan Tsvangirai and the MDC. After disputed elections in 2008, Ernest Mnangagwa was the man who was put in charge of a tremendously repressive campaign against the MDC, which saw Robert Mugabe back in power.
Also oversaw the security services during the Matabeleland massacres.
Absolutely. These were some terrible massacres after independence during the 1980s of one particular ethnic group in Matabeleland, the Ndebele people, and people will not forget that. He is a man who has a very tainted history. So even though there's all this hope for Zimbabwe, there will also be fear at the back of people's minds that maybe not a huge amount will change.
Mary Harper. Events in Zimbabwe are being closely watched across Africa. The chairman of the African Union, the president of Guinea, Alpha Condé, said he was truly delighted that Robert Mugabe had stepped down. But he added it was a shame that such a great fighter was, as he put it, leaving through the back door. In South Africa, which is currently home to many Zimbabweans who fled across the border, there is intense interest in events in Harare. As I heard from our correspondent in Johannesburg, Milton Nkosi.
the reaction in South Africa, particularly from Zimbabweans who've made South Africa their home for the last few years since the Zimbabwean economic crisis, has been of jubilation, excitement and euphoria. Most people I met tonight were excited, happy to see the back of Robert Mugabe because they said he had presided over their own misfortunes when he ran the economy to the ground. But as far as the government is concerned, there hasn't been any official reaction.
Now, you've watched events in Zimbabwe for many years. What do you think this means for Africa, the end of an era for one of the giants of the independence struggle?
This is a very big moment, not just for Zimbabweans, but for the continent as a whole, to see one of the leaders of the liberation struggle step down. Robert Mugabe's role is a textbook material because he liberated his own people from the bondage of white oppression when they were under white minority rule. And therefore he became a hero and he was a worthy leader. He also embarked on very productive policies, including education. Zimbabweans are one of the highest educated African nations, sometimes on average even more educated than some of their wealthier neighbors. Agricultural policy, Zimbabwe was a net exporter of tobacco because of its fertile and arable land. But somewhere in the 2000s, something went horribly wrong. President Mugabe changed tact and he started confiscating, expropriating land without compensation. And that drove the economy into a tailspin. And that is the sadness of this moment, that a man who was celebrated, but today people were happy to see him go because he had been in power for far too long.
But I guess with those mixed feelings about his legacy, also concerns about what lies ahead.
Yes, indeed, because his political party remains in power with the change of hands now to Emmerson Mnangagwa, his vice president, who he sacked 2 weeks ago and who's now returning to take over the reins. But most people are concerned that this change has to be an all-inclusive transformation. In other words, they must include the opposition parties so that Zimbabwe can forge a new future for itself. Remember, there are elections scheduled for next year, second half of 2018, and they're hoping that those elections can be free and fair and not be rigged as the ones that Mr. Mugabe presided over in the last few decades.
Nelson Nkosi in Johannesburg. In other reaction, the US said the change in leadership in Zimbabwe must lead to free, fair and inclusive elections. In Britain, Prime Minister Theresa May said Zimbabwe had a chance to be free of the oppression that had characterised Mr. Mugabe's rule. And we'll have more on events in Zimbabwe in a moment. First, though, a quick look at some of the day's other news. The Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri has arrived in Beirut 2.5 weeks after he shocked the nation by announcing his resignation during a visit to Saudi Arabia. That statement prompted a political crisis in Lebanon, and many believed he was being held against his will by the Saudis. On Saturday, Mr. Hariri travelled to Paris, where he met the French President Emmanuel Macron, who's been trying to broker a way out of the stalemate. Mr. Hariri then promised to return in time for Lebanon's independence celebrations on Wednesday. The US has announced it's imposing new sanctions on North Korea. The American Treasury said the measures were designed to stop the funding of the country's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. On Monday, President Trump designated North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism, a move that was welcomed by South Korea and Japan. Neda Tawfik reports from New York.
The new measures target a Chinese individual and several Chinese firms that do business with Pyongyang, as well as 20 shipping and transportation companies that facilitate trade. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says the sanctions will target $750 million in trade between China and North Korea in an effort to contain Pyongyang's nuclear program.
The U.S. military says it's killed more than 100 al-Shabaab fighters in an airstrike in Somalia. The operation targeted a militant camp northwest of the capital, Mogadishu. And Google is to de-rank stories from 2 Kremlin-owned news providers in response to claims that Russia has interfered in foreign elections. It means search results from Russia Today and Sputnik will not appear as prominently as those from other news outlets. Now back to our main story, the news that Robert Mugabe, who led Zimbabwe since independence in 1980, has resigned. The BBC's World Affairs editor John Simpson has seen many authoritarian rulers come and go and met Robert Mugabe on a number of occasions. He gave me this assessment of the end of the Mugabe era.
The 21st century has entered the depressing ancient politics of dictatorship, and instead of seeing the man murdered in a tunnel like Colonel Gaddafi, instead of seeing him hanged like Saddam Hussein or shot like Ceausescu in Romania, he ended his 37 years with a letter. And I mean, if that's not a big step forward, I really don't know what is.
How did he stay in power for all that time?
People were scared. People were too scared to do anything about it. In fact, the thing that always used to impress me whenever I managed to get into Zimbabwe, which wasn't easy because the BBC was banned there for a long time, but was how brave some people were. But it was just some people, and the only time really that it seemed to me that Mugabe came close to being toppled was in the first round of the 2008 presidential election, which was clearly won by Morgan Tsvangirai, the Movement for Democratic Change presidential candidate. That's in spite of everything that ZANU-PF had managed to do to stop MDC people voting. He still won. And, of course, then Mugabe and his friends pulled out all the stops and started attacking the MDC in the most brutal way. And Morgan Tsvangirai, just out of really kind of self-protection and protection for his associates, just stepped out and said, I'm not going to stand in the second round. But it came close, and you know, voting is one thing, and a more or less secret ballot, that's one thing. But coming out in the streets, that's never really quite been Zimbabwe's thing.
And that election, a sign of Robert Mugabe's ruthlessness, but also he was incredibly cunning.
Oh, extraordinarily cunning. I interviewed him quite a lot of times in those early years. And then, of course, he was absolutely on top of everything. And he was always the cleverest man in the room. I mean, me certainly included. But none of his officials had any kind of equivalence in terms of brain power, simple brain power and articulacy. And, you know, I saw him negotiating with British officials, for instance. He ran rings round them. And right down to the end, I thought, I mean, when he was on television a couple of nights ago and seemed to read from a different script from the one that they were expecting and so on, didn't resign, I thought he's done it again, or he's doing it again. He's setting different people against each other. He's worked out a way round it. He might be 93, he might not be really kind of quite on top of everything, but I thought this is what he was doing. Only this time it didn't work.
Now, as Zimbabwe's first independence leader, Zimbabwe's first leader, he did a huge amount for the country before things started to go wrong.
Well, in a way, the sort of unfair thing, fairness is perhaps not quite the right word, but, you know, Zimbabwe is an extraordinarily literate society. You see different figures, but one of the figures that's often quoted is 90% literacy rate, which far in excess of anything in the region or in much of the rest of Africa. And that was Robert Mugabe. It wasn't the white government from before. Certainly, it was Robert Mugabe, an intellectual himself, who wanted people to be able to read and write. When I've been there, going out onto the streets to interview people in the streets is a joy, because everybody is able to express themselves in a really articulate way. Not true, for instance, in South Africa. I mean, quite a lot of people do express themselves well, but not everybody. But in Zimbabwe, it was unusual, I used to feel, not to have somebody whose words you could put on air straight away.
A very beautiful country too. Are you now hopeful for the future of Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I am. I'm hopeful for two reasons. One, because it's quite clear to me that the outside world, actually, funnily enough, just as they did with Mugabe in 1980, is prepared to put its hand over his eyes and ears and everything else and overlook, forgive anything that ZANU-PF and any of the others may have done in the interests of seeing Zimbabwe going well. And Britain, America, France, Germany will all be putting large amounts of money in there, as the Chinese have. Only the Chinese did it with a different purpose, of course. That's one thing. But the other thing is just nobody can go there without loving that country. So I'm optimistic simply because I really want it to work.
The BBC's World Affairs editor, John Simpson. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available to download later. If you want to contact us, our email address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. And we'll end this edition with the emotional scenes on the streets of Harare. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.
We are happy. We are so happy.
We're overwhelmed.
We're really overwhelmed, hey?
We are excited because what we are now looking for is for a change of power. Yes. Now the wheel of change has started.
Now I believe that I did not suffer in vain. I am happy I actually got incarcerated. I got incarcerated for this day. Independence is finally here.
Rest in peace! Rest in peace! People are scattered all over the world. Families are all over the world. In England, America, people want to come back home.
We united against this man and we brought him down finally, and I'm so glad.
Let's remember that we still need to get rid of Mugabe, the system, Mugabe, the ideology, and just, build a new system of democracy, freedoms.
37 years being cruel to the nation. So we call him the beast. So today we are very happy that he has resigned, and we're now looking forward for a new Zimbabwe.
Happy independence to Zimbabwe. Some are even saying after 37 years we are truly free, and I believe I agree.
Today we celebrate, we rejoice, we thank God for this wonderful day. Oh, I don't know how to say it. I'm more than happy, guys.